Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. I'm Jake, the Muslim Metaphysician. Today we have a interesting episode for you guys. The title of the stream is called "Is God Dependent?" A response to Khalil Andani. And so it's pretty self-evident for those who don't know and those who care to know, which whoever you are is interesting. Khalil Andani is a person I debated about a month ago on the subject of Tawheed, which I've done some videos since then on the subject, responding to his arguments. He had 10 broad arguments that he was trying to use in the debate, which he had a very specific purpose behind it, and I've made that clear in other videos. But anyway, in my not my previous video, a couple videos ago, I responded to 8 of the 10 arguments. And so this video is going to be a response to 2 of his arguments that I didn't get a chance to discuss last time. Now, as you guys know, a lot of my streams are pretty long. So if you aren't familiar with it, make sure you strap in your seatbelt for this one, folks, because this one might be quite lengthy. We might, I don't know. Let's see how far we can get into this. Might be on up to 2 hours, and the reason is I could respond to these things in a very short manner and just giving quick responses. However, I want to go into detail as much as I can. Not as much as I can. We can always go on more and more forever, but I want to give a lot of detail and context to these 2 arguments and respond to them as I see fit. Anyway, with that being said, guys, I don't want to belabor the point too much. Let's kind of jump right into this. As I said, salam to everybody in the chat. So let me share my screen here and show you, 1 second here, what Mr. Andani's first argument, not his first argument. Actually, the arguments I'm going to deal with are numbers 8 and 9. In there, I dealt with the other 8, but I'm going to deal with argument number 9 first, just because it's going to take me less time to explain it and to respond to it. Then I'm going to get to argument number 8, and I'm going to go into a lot of detail on that, specifically reading from the text of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, who thoroughly responded to this point and refutes it. And I'm going to clear up some of the misconceptions as to what I said in the video or in the original debate, why I said what I said, and even clarifying for some Ash'aris and Maturidis, because I'm going to show you in reality our position on this issue is pretty much exactly the same. I'm going to show that from Imam Ghazali and Arazi as well, stating this and refuting Khalil's argument. Because some people thought, well, wait, Khalil asked this question, is God dependent? Which is the subject of the title of this video. And at one point it appeared that Jake actually said, yes, God is dependent. Well, hold on a second. You have to understand what it means, what the context is. And that's why I wasn't being pedantic or playing games when I said, well, what do you mean by dependent? Because there are at least 4 and actually more definitions and understandings of what the term dependent, how it can be used both in Arabic and in English and modern analytic metaphysics today. Okay, so, but anyway, I'll get to a little bit more of that later on when we deal with the second argument. So let me share my screen here, and I'm going to deal with the argument number 9 first, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, here we go. All right, so you should be able to see that, folks. I hope it's relatively clear. A second here, I can move this tab around. Okay. All right, so you'll see here it says 9 for divine simplicity, finite attributes and arbitrary limits. And you just zoom in here. It says per Sunni Athari theology, God has real attributes that are distinct from one another in his essence, which is true. All of this is true. God is infinite and unlimited according to all Muslims. This is his claim. He says every divine attribute differs from other attributes. Therefore, every divine attribute is finite and limited, right? Atheny Creed says that God possesses multiple distinct finite and limited attributes. He gives some examples, and of course he chose those for a specific reason, which we'll get to in a minute. And then he says an infinite God cannot possess finite attributes. Okay. And then also in tandem with that, he tried to, and which was another form of an internal critique from a guy who, by the way, told you he didn't know that an internal critique in a debate was valid, which is very strange. He tried to say that this contradicts both Jake and Tap Thought Adventure podcast way of arguing for God's existence by demonstrating, in at least some instances, that the way in which something is contingent is by the fact that it's arbitrarily limited. And we use this as part of the discussion when talking about the contingency argument and proving that a necessary being or God exists. And wait, Jake believes in that God has a finite amount of attributes. He rejects divine simplicity. Each attribute is different from each other. Therefore, every divine attribute is finite and delimited or limited. And if we apply Jake's standards for identifying contingency, this would mean that Jake's God would be contingent. Astaghfirullah. This is the basics of the argument. Okay. Now, let me stop sharing my screen here so you can see me on full screen. And again, I'm trying to accurately represent Khalil's argument, even though I think he doesn't really deserve much respect. But I try to accurately represent the argument, and then I'll respond to it. Okay, so the first idea is that each divine attribute is finite because it is different than the others. Well, if this is a fair criticism, and again, this is specific to Khalil's view, if this is a fair criticism that just because each divine attribute is different than each other, that therefore means that it's finite, and because God possesses finite attributes or is finite in some respects, supposedly anyway, this would then entail that God is contingent. Well, if that's the case, it would also entail, likewise, that Khalil's God is finite and limited, and that therefore he is contingent. Why? Because unless he believes that his God is identical to creation, or unless he believes in wahdat al-wujud, which he has told me actually explicitly in private messages that he doesn't believe in wahdat al-wujud, and that he is not a pantheist. And again, I'm not conflating wahdat al-wujud and pantheism. It's a whole nother can of worms that I know that people use the terms wahdat al-wujud and there are different conceptions of it. I understand all of that. Here's the point. If Khalil rejects pantheism, which he does, then his God is also, according to his own standard, is finite and limited and therefore contingent. Why? Because his God is particularized or particular, i.e., he is different than other things. If his God is particular and different than other things, this would then mean that his God would be limited in the fact that he isn't all of existence. In fact, Khalil himself does not even believe he's in the category of existence. He believes that his God does not exist, and he also does not exist, meaning that he's fawqa al-wujud, he's above and beyond existence. Okay? If he's above and beyond existence, then he isn't everything. And therefore, he is arbitrarily limited according to your own standards. So your whole argument already goes out the window. It's a ridiculous argument. Okay, so this is the first point. Now, he also says you cannot have divine infinity while God is comprised of multiple finite attributes. And in fact, in the actual video, in the clip of the video, he claims that this is a logical contradiction. As a matter of fact, let me actually play it for you guys, because I want to do complete justice to Mr. Andani's argument. Let's see here. Which one is it going to be? It's going to be the second one. Okay. Yeah, second one. 1 second, guys. Here, let me share my screen and I'll actually play you, because it's only 1.5 minutes long. You'll be able to listen to what exactly his argument was. Okay, here it is. All right, so let's listen to how he explains it.
Furthermore, When the Atharis say that God's attributes are distinct from one another and God's essence, what they are saying is that each divine attribute, in being different from others, is finite. Okay, something is finite if it is limited and it excludes things that are different from itself.
Sorry, guys. You guys know I'm a bit slow here. So thanks for letting me know that I was muted. So anyway, the point is, listen to what he just said. Let me just back it up, actually, a couple seconds, because it's very important.
Okay, something is finite if it is limited and it excludes things that are different from itself.
Something is finite and limited if it excludes things that are other and different from itself. So here's the first point. Here's my first point. Okay, Mr. Khalil, is your God a part of creation? Is he identical to creation, or is he distinct from his creation? If I don't believe that you believe he's part of creation, nor do you believe in pantheism that he's identical to creation. If you reject both of those claims, then your God is distinct from creation and therefore is limited. Because notice, listen to what you just said again.
Okay, something is finite if it is limited and it excludes things that are different from itself.
Something is finite if it excludes things that are different and other than itself. Does your God exclude and are things different than it? Simple question. Simple question. Phil, do you believe in pantheism, or do you believe that your God is distinct from creation? If you believe that your God is distinct and separate from creation, then he's limited. And that therefore would mean that your God is finite, and therefore he's contingent. So if you've refuted your own position, your entire argument is gone. But anyway, let's keep listening.
So to say that God is infinite, but he's comprised of multiple finite attributes is a logical contradiction. You cannot have divine infinity composed of finite attributes. Furthermore,
okay, so here's his second claim. You cannot have divine infinity while God is comprised of multiple finite attributes. And he claims that this is a logical contradiction. Well, he has the assumption that it's a logical contradiction because obviously he has a certain understanding of divine infinity, which literally doesn't make any sense, and which his own position is contradictory. Why? Because given how he just defined divine infinity, God would have to be identical to his creation. If he's distinct and different through his creation, then he would have to be finite and limited. Simple, because he wouldn't be all pervading all throughout space and everything else that exists. So it doesn't, his assumption and at the root of his argument is that it's a logical contradiction based on his assumption what divine infinity is. But we reject your understanding of divine infinity. In fact, for the Muslims, unlike the kuffar or the kafir such as yourself, we do not believe that divine infinity is in the way that you have proposed it. Oh, that God, if he's simply different than something else, then he's finite. No, that's not the understanding. The understanding is that God is qualitatively infinite, meaning that for any attribute that he has, it is perfect. So in terms of the quality, we could say in a colloquial sense that he is qualitatively infinite. For any quality that he possesses, it's infinite in the sense that it's perfect and couldn't be better. That is the Muslim position. However, don't make this claim that you are saying that God is quantitatively infinite in the sense that there is no distinction between him and any of his attributes or anything in creation. So again, your argument is based on assumption of what divine infinity is, which we reject, which is basically you're already assuming divine simplicity, because the very notion that you're using of the very notion that you're using here to make your argument about divine infinity assumes a notion of divine simplicity, and even a notion of divine simplicity and divine infinity that would contradict your own view and your own model. Okay, so there you go. Again, simple refutation. He claims it's a logical contradiction. It's not. In fact, you've refuted yourself. Let's listen further to
The
what he
Atharis
says.
affirm that God has two yads. Whatever yad means, he has two yads. Well, guess what? Two is a quantitative arbitrary limit. Why does he have two yads? Why can't he have 7 yads or 1,000 yads? So when the Atharis affirm in their creed that God has 2 hands or 2 yads, they're giving an arbitrary limit to God. And according to the Thought Adventure podcast that I've watched, anything with arbitrary limits is contingent, not necessary. So the Athari concept of Tawheed posits a contingent God. Now, what is our position on attributes?
Okay, so there you go. Now he mentions specific attributes. He mentions 2 yeds, or, yadain. He mentions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has 2 hands or 2 yeds. And he says, well, this is an arbitrary limit, right? And according to the Thought Adventure podcast, this would make God contingent. Okay, well, the response is this. I've already kind of dealt with the response based on the other attributes, because now the question is this supposed to be a problem, okay, that is for specific attributes and not others? Meaning, does the same example work for God's knowledge and God's power? Or is it specifically only problematic for his yed? Here's the question. That's the question that Khalil Andani needs to answer. If it is the claim, right? If it is a claim that it is not specific for just this attribute, but it is specific, it is general for any attributes and any rejection of divine simplicity, then I've already addressed this issue and showed how it's a false argument. If it's the former, that it is specific to Yad Allah, okay, and there's something unique about these particular attribute or some other attribute, rather than knowledge, power, will, etc., then Khalil needs to give an explanation as to why that is, which he failed to do in the actual debate. Okay. Secondly, Rasmussen himself, who is an expert on the contingency argument, even though you called him and other analytic philosophers monkeys, and not monkey in the sense that you didn't disrespect him, monkey in the sense which you yourself had admitted it, which we can show as well. We have documentation of you admitting that what you mean by monkey is someone who is illogical, irrational, doesn't know how to think properly and use rational argumentation. Well, Rasmussen, whether you like it or not, who is one leading experts today on the contingency argument, denies divine simplicity and also believes in the argument from arbitrary limits to establish that something is contingent. Although, ironically enough, in a limited sense, not in the way that you think. So the question here that I have for Khalil is, does this argument apply to Rasmussen's model as well, or is it just specific to the ethity model? Meaning, does it apply to Rasmussen's model of God, and anyone who rejects divine simplicity, or even some other forms of divine simplicity? Or is this criticism only specific to Jake and the ethity model? Because Rasmussen himself denies divine simplicity and affirms that arbitrary limits result in something contingent, and yet he believes in multiple real distinct attributes of God. He does not believe in divine simplicity. If you say that it does apply to Rasmussen, then wait, is it just that he's a monkey? And no disrespect to Josh, I have love for Josh. I'm just saying this because in the words of Khalil Andani, is he just too stupid of a monkey to actually see such a blatant internal contradiction in his model? That on the one hand, he says arbitrary limits result in God being contingent. On the other hand, arbitrary limits mean that something is contingent. On the other hand, God has arbitrary limits because he rejects divine simplicity, and therefore he doesn't conclude that God is contingent, and so he's contradicting himself because he says God is a necessary being. Is Rasmussen that stupid that he's missing this, that he doesn't see it? Or is it the case that Khalil is obviously missing something due to him misunderstanding the application of arbitrary limits with respect to contingency? Which one do you think is more likely, folks? Well, it's obviously the latter. Khalil is using a concept based on what he's heard on TAP and from Rasmussen about arbitrary limits, and he's misapplying it to the case of divine simplicity, because we don't use it in the manner that he is, and neither does Rasmussen. Otherwise, Rasmussen would just be a dummy, some dumb monkey that doesn't understand how he's so easily contradicting himself, and nobody else has pointed this out, by the way. Now, if it does not, that's if it does apply to Rasmussen. On the other hand, if it does not apply to Rasmussen's model, then you must explain why this criticism of internal inconsistency and why God would be contingent is only specific to Jake or the Ethides model, but is not specific to Rasmussen's model. That's what you need to do. Now, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, and I'll try to argue for you. Well, it could be the case that you want to say that the argument specifically only applies to, although you already see in your diagram here, you have power, knowledge, life, compassion, justice, all of which Rasmussen believes in. So you would have to say that the argument is referring to him, and there's not anything specifically difficult about Yadullah or any of these other attributes. However, I'll try to help you out. I'll say that maybe, let's make it even more specific. Maybe you're saying that this argument only applies to what are called sifat khabariyah, which means the sifat or the attributes that are affirmed from Muslims, not Khalil Andani, because he's a kafir, unfortunately, but we hope that he comes to Islam, inshallah ta'ala. Sifat khabariyah, which is basically the idea of the attributes that we Muslims affirm that are known through the text of the Quran wa Sunnah alone and are not arrived at merely through rational reflection or deduction. Okay, which would be things, could be things like the law, certain actions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala performs, etc., which are only known through the text and are not arrived at merely from a rational deduction, which I've never claimed to have any issue with that. Okay, so however, that would just then be an argument that as a Muslim, we cannot affirm any sifa or attribute that cannot be proven through reason alone. And that if you do affirm any attribute that cannot be proven through reason alone by a deductive argument, then that would result in arbitrary limits, which is obviously not the case. This is what the argument would be reduced to, and certainly not from an ethity perspective or anything that we've ever argued on TAP, because obviously we affirm the attributes that are known through the text alone. So at this point, the argument seems to lose force, as it is not an arbitrary limit if the affirmation of the text and its understanding is necessary. Then it would not constitute an arbitrary limit in the manner that Khalil at least is imagining. And part of this is speculation on my part because he hasn't really been clear with his argument. So I have to fill in some of the blanks. Also, the assumption or the usage of arbitrary limits that he's using as part of this argument, which we showed earlier, it's just anything that isn't identical to itself is an arbitrary limit, is a very loose manner, and he's using it on mere conceivability. Well, could I imagine just anything and a mere conceivability principle that something is different? This is not how it's being employed. It's not just by mere conceivability and mere of something not being identical to itself. This is not how the principle is used either by Rasmussen or myself and the other TAP members. Now, I'll even give you the benefit of the doubt. If we did give that impression, well, then we apologize if that was the impression, but that's never been the argument. The principle is used in a much more narrow manner. It's not merely anything that's not identical to itself is arbitrarily limited, and anything that we can merely just conceive of differently would be arbitrarily limited. That's not how the argument is used. Okay? The principle is used much more narrowly. And we can go into much more in depth on how that is, but we want to have time to address the other argument as well, inshallah. So anyway, I'm trying to fill in some of the gaps for Khalil to help him out, just because his argument is so bad and that it wasn't really articulated properly. Anyway, therefore, there is not a genuine conflict between our usage of arbitrary limits and a rejection of divine simplicity or an affirmation of the Ethnic Creed. Now, let's listen further to what Khalil actually says here about divine predication, although it's not directly related here to, it's not directly related. Anyway, let's listen.
Of Tawheed posits a contingent God. Now, what is our position on attributes? Here's the thing.
It was just him contrasting it and saying what his position is. And I've already refuted this in detail videos. And there's more that is going to come out soon because there's been some interesting developments, but I'll get to that in a second.
If attributes refer to distinct finite realities, which is what the Atheris believe, then yes, of course, God is beyond attributes because God is one and infinite. So these finite distinct attributes like knowledge, power, life, and justice, these belong in creation. Okay, when the Quran refers to God as all-knowing or all-living or all-powerful, we can affirm that he is, but the meaning of that is that God is the creator of life, knowledge, and power.
Okay, so he says we can affirm that God is all-knowing and all-powerful and has life, right? But the meaning of that is he is the creator of knowledge, or he causes whatever is to know, which you can see at the bottom of the screen by Abdul Karim Shahristani, right? Which is the only, interestingly enough, the only claimed Ismaili author he quoted directly in his opening statement by name. What did he say? He is knowing only in the sense that he causes whatever is knowing to know. And he is powerful only in the sense that he empowers whatever is powerful. He is truth only in the sense that he makes the truth true and makes the false false. And he is living only in the sense that he gives life and death. On the same page, you'll see Ibn Sina and Falsafa, Ibn Arabi and Sufism, Ismailis and the Hikmah tradition, all of which he is claiming all of these different groups believe in the same thing. I believe in what this text says here at the bottom. Listen to what he says now.
Not that God is the bearer of life, knowledge, and power. And there's a consensus between the philosophers, the Sufis, and the Ismailis on this point. There's actually consensus on this. Now,
so listen to what he said. There's actually consensus on this point. Well, I've demonstrated time and time again in my previous videos that there's not consensus on this point. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And this was a major part of my argument, that you're acting as if there's consensus on this point, and there's not. Therefore, you're defending a contradictory amalgamation of positions. Ibn Sina and Shahristani, for example, did not see eye to eye. In fact, guess where this text is from, guys? You see this Shahristani text here? You know where it's from? It's from a book called Wrestling with the Philosophers. And the philosopher that he's mainly refuting in this entire text is Ibn Sina, who he mentions by name. And I've shown in previous videos that Khalil conveniently clipped out this part of the quote, but just in the context of that quote itself, he is actually refuting Ibn Sina. Why? Because Ibn Sina uses, yes, analogical predication for wujud or existence when it comes to existence. He first starts off by saying, no, you're wrong. You cannot use what's called analogical predication for existence. And then he goes on to say, and you must not use it for any other attribute. The only type of predication that can be used for God, according to Ash-Shahristani, is equivocal predication. But Mr. Khalil Andani has been embarrassing himself. He thinks that this quote from Shahristani actually is an example of analogical predication, when Shahristani himself says it's not, and it is actually a refutation of analogical predication. Okay? Because Ibn Sina believed in the concept of what's called tashkik al-wujud, which means the modulation of existence, right? And anyway, I don't want to go into too much depth on it, but he believed in wujud being used as a predicate for God in an analogical manner, meaning that there is similarity in the meaning of the term and how it's being applied to God, and also how it's being applied to creation. Now, Shahristani had a big problem with that because he thought that it would result in tashbih. which I showed in other videos. My last video, I showed that he believed it would result in tashbih. This is why he accused the philosophers of it, because they ascribed negative and relational attributes to God that were used as analogical predications. He believed that only equivocal predications could be applied to God. So in fact, there is no consensus on it, and this is why you've embarrassed yourself time and time again.
First, the Sufis and the Ismailis on this point. There's actually consensus on this. Now,
so anyway, he's claiming there's consensus. Anyway, that is the first argument that I wanted to deal with, which is his whole idea of there being arbitrary limits. I showed his misunderstanding of arbitrary limits and its utilization from the Tapp and Rasmussen context. I explained the issue of Sifat al-Khabariya and that it is known through the text, which we don't have a problem with, because this debate was not a text based on, this debate was not supposed to be on purely from a rational perspective. This was including the text. It even included our Aqidah texts, right? And also, not me, nor I don't think anybody really. Anyway, I don't want to represent everybody, but I'll represent myself and say I've never claimed that every specific aspect of God can be rationally deduced from first principles. I've never claimed that. In fact, what we claim is that you can prove that a necessary being exists. You can prove that it has certain attributes, even though you don't believe that. And so once we prove that, which I'll go on to show, Ibn Taymiyyah says, your God is already out the window anyway. But there are certain things, and this is a key distinctive feature, not a key distinctive feature, right? Because anyway, other groups besides the Ethidis believe in this as well, that there are some aspects about God that are known through the text alone, right? We don't have a problem with this. This is not a problem at all, whether it be attributes of action, whether it be other specific sifat. This is not an issue, okay? So if you're going to reduce it to that and just say simply, well, Jake needs to prove every single attribute of God and every action of God from first principles, well, then that's your standard, which I don't accept and I don't agree to. And as a matter of fact, I don't think you can even do that about your own conception of God, which I've been showing time and time again. So yeah, it's not a logical contradiction. And rather, anyway, as I showed, one of the main points is that you would refute yourself based on your very, very broad understanding of what a limit would be. Your God would be limited and finite as well, because there's a distinction between him and creation, and therefore he has a limit to him, and so he would be contingent. So your whole argument goes out the window. Now let's go on to the second argument, which was actually argument number 8. Now let me share the screen for that first. Where is it here? Okay. 1 second. Yep. All right. Let me share the screen and show you the second argument that he gave. Okay, so you see here 8, for divine simplicity, ontological collapse problem. He says, Ethidi Tawheed, God is one and many. And again, he's playing games here. But God's knowledge does not equal power. Anyway, the whole idea that we reject divine simplicity. Then quotes a text from Ibn Hamdan, who is an Ethidi scholar. The attributes of God are not identical to him and not other than him. He claims that it's a violation of the law of excluded middle. I'm just explaining the slide, and then I'm going to play the clip from him and break it down and go through each step as we did with the last one. He says, are God's essence and real distinct attributes each necessary in itself, meaning independent nase, or are they contingent in themselves, i.e. dependent? And he gives 4 different options. First option, God's essence depends upon his independent attributes. He says this is polytheism. God's attributes depend on his necessary essence. He says this is divine simplicity, which this is a key one we're going to get back to. God's attributes and essence are all necessary in itself. Polytheism, even more polytheism, he says. And God's essence and attributes are all contingent or interdependent, which he says is atheism, which is very interesting. Anyway, let me stop sharing. We can hear it from the great doctor of Harvard himself explaining to us his argument here. And it'll lead off of, let me see here. I'm going to have to scroll back now because of the simple fact that this was earlier in the stream. Okay. All right. Let me just scroll back. Okay, so here, let me share my screen for you guys, and you can hear his argument.
Reason to the authority doctrine of attributes, of real distinct attributes, this entire doctrine is going to collapse. Firstly, the authorities say the attributes are not identical to God and they're not other than God. This violates logic. It violates the law of the excluded middle. But even if you get past that logical problem, the question we ask is this: if of real distinct attributes, this entire doctrine is going to collapse. Firstly, the authorities say the attributes are not identical to God and they're not other than God. This violates logic. It violates the law of the excluded middle. But even if you get past...
So his first criticism is that this conception of the attributes not being God nor other than God violates the law of the excluded middle. Now, mind you, this formulation is not a distinctively ethity feature. In fact, the Ash'aris and Maturidis affirm it as well. Now, he claims that it's a violation of the law of excluded middle because he says that, well, anyway, you heard him. I don't need to keep explaining it over and over again. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show very clearly that it's not a violation of the law of excluded middle, especially if you're charitable and you actually understand what is being said here. So, when we say that the attributes are not him, we are saying that they are not identical to him, which means you are refuting or denying divine simplicity on the one hand. On the other hand, when we say that they are not other than him, we are saying that they are not, his attributes are not created. They are not things that are separate and distinct from God himself. So the attributes, the Sunni Muslim position, and not the position of the kuffar, as Khalil likes to represent, is that the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are not identical or are not him in the text, in the context that they are not identical to him, meaning it is a refutation or rejection of divine simplicity, and it is not other than him in the sense that they are not, these attributes are not created and are not completely separable or separate and distinct from him and his essence. They are subsisting or subsist in his essence. So it is not a violation of logic. It is not a violation of the law of excluded middle. And I'm not the first one to say this. And this is not only an ethity position as well. Now what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to demonstrate that it's not a distinctively ethity position and that this is not just Jake's explanation of the phrase. What I'm going to show here is that I'm going to show here, one second here, guys. One second. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to show here a Maturidi scholar, Dr. Nazif, and I don't want to butcher his last name, so I attempt to pronounce it. But Dr. Nazif, he is a Turkish scholar who is a Maturidi, and in an interview on this subject of divine simplicity, he actually explains it in the exact same way that I have just explained it. So hold on a second. Let me share my screen here. Okay. Here you go. Let's take a listen.
Here we have a question by Muhammad Hanif. So he's asking, isn't the Ash'ari relationship a violation of the law of the excluded middle? So can you first define that before you answer?
No, well, it's not.
Notice the question is from Muhammad Hanif, who's a friend of mine. Anyway, he asked the question, isn't the Ash'ari relationship a violation of the law of excluded middle, which is the very same claim that Khalil made. Let's listen to his answer.
Law of the excluded middle. So can you first define that before you answer?
No, well, it's not. I mean, excluded middle proposes that there are two options, logical options, no three options. For example, if something is the case, it cannot be the negation of the case. There are always two options, one case and its negation, one case and its negation. For example, this smartphone is black, its negation is the smartphone is not black. There is no third option. However, usually people confuse this. This smartphone is black. The logical negation of it is not black, not white. Okay. For example, if I say this iPhone is either black or white, there are options in the middle. It would be gray or another color. But if I say black or non-black, you exhaust all possibilities in terms of blackness. Okay? Because non-blackness include gray, yellow, all the other which are not black. Okay? Here, when you say God is not identical with attributes nor distinct, you do not exhaust all possibilities. As I said, they understand distinctness in terms of createdness. Okay? So, like blackness and whiteness, there might be different positions in between, which are not excluded by this formula. Okay.
Okay, so you see very clearly that he says it does not violate the law of excluded middle, and that when you understand what is actually meant by the phrase and represent it accurately, and mind you, this is a Maturidi who believes in the same formula and says the same thing, that when you actually properly understood it, it's not a violation of the law of excluded middle. On the one hand, it's a denial of divine simplicity, and on the other hand, it's a denial that the attributes are created or separate from his essence. So again, this just shows, and Khalil, I think, honestly knows this. He's probably even watched this video. He's read enough to actually know this, but he's just uncharitable, and he's trying to, use some rhetoric with the audience, say, oh, Jake's this anti-logical Takfiri guy who's against the law of excluded middle. No, I'm not. Be charitable. Let's understand what the other person is saying and represent it accurately, which you and many of my other critics seem to be incapable and unable to actually do. Now, let's continue playing the clip from Andani, because we have jointly just refuted that. I just worked with a Maturidi. Imagine that. Oh my God, that's bid'ah. I quoted a Maturidi to back what I'm saying here. Let's continue listening to Andani. 1 second. Okay. Let me just X this out, actually. Let's see the rest of his bad argument here, guys. Okay, here we go. Bismillah.
That logical problem, the question we ask is this: if God's essence and his attributes are all mutually distinct, which is what Jake believes and what the Atharis believe, we ask, is the essence and each attribute necessary in itself or dependent in itself? Now, here are the options. If you answer that the essence is dependent and the attributes are independent, you believe in multiple.
So just to be clear on the question he's asking, are the attributes necessary in themselves, or are they contingent in themselves? Meaning, are they necessary or contingent? Are they independent or dependent? This is his question that he's asking. And again, this same question would apply to Ash'aris and Maturidis. It's not only specific to Athari Creed, as he knows, but some people may have the misconception of that based on his presentation.
Necessary beings, polytheism. If you say the attributes depend on the essence, multiple. If you answer that the self.
So he goes through 4 options. So let's listen to them.
Or dependent in itself. Now, here are the options. If you answer that the essence is dependent and the attributes are independent, you believe in multiple necessary beings, polytheism. If you.
Okay, so he says, if you believe that the essence is dependent, okay, and all of the attributes are independent, then you're a polytheist. Okay, we don't believe that.
say the attributes depend on the essence. The attributes are dependent, the essence is independent. Well, that is divine simplicity. There's only one necessary independent reality, which is God. So that's our position.
So then he says, if you believe that God's attributes depend upon his essence, then that equals divine simplicity. No, it does not. First of all, it does not equal divine simplicity, which I'm going to show from our position in just a second. And he says, oh, that would then mean that there's only one necessary reality, which is God, which is the essence. No, but you're assuming within all of that, you're already assuming divine simplicity, that God equals this sort of independent thing, which what you're talking about when you use necessary essence, right? But for us, God is his essence and his attributes, which when I said to you in the cross-examination section, you said, whoa, as if you were shocked. This is obvious. Everybody believes this from the Sunni camp. What are you talking about? This is no shocker. But anyway, we're going to have much more to say about this idea of how he thinks option number 2 necessarily is divine simplicity, which it's not.
If you say the essence and attributes are all independent necessary beings, that's more polytheism. And if you say they're...
So then he says, if you say that they're all independent and not dependent, then that's polytheism. Well, again, it's going to hinge on what you mean by dependent and independent, which we'll get to in quite a bit of detail in a minute.
All dependent, contingent things, that's atheism. So the other...
And then he says, if you believe that they're all independent, dependent beings, then that's atheism. I don't know how that's atheism, other than him trying to say that you wouldn't have a necessary being. I guess that's the implication. Anyway, we reject that option as well. So anyway, options number 1 we reject, okay, and option number 4 we clearly reject, and then options 2 and 3 they need to be fleshed out in terms of understanding what independent and dependent are and how they're functioning in these phrases. But let's continue listening.
The position on Tawheed is going to collapse into one of these 4, and therefore this view of Tawheed, cannot stand this test of reason.
Okay, so then based on that, he says that Athari Creed cannot stand a test of reason because any of these options is either going to result in divine simplicity, which then would be his position, atheism, or polytheism. Well, you reject atheism and polytheism, so you must accept divine simplicity. This is the claim, or just violate law of excluded middle, as he thinks in the prior case. Anyway, so let me stop sharing my screen. Okay. And what I want to do for you is play a clip from the same video that I just played a clip from before, from Dr. Nazif, addressing at least partially this issue. Okay. So let me share my screen again. You're saying you do not see why interdependence between the essence and the attributes is a problem. Well, you'll see in a second what I mean by that. When I say would be problematic, again, it comes down to the definition of dependence, which, don't worry, for probably the whole next hour, it's going to be a Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah reading session where he goes through all of these points, okay, which is going to be the same answer that I was attempting to give in the debate anyway. But let me show you here. Okay, so this is Dr. Nazif responding to this issue. And again, he's a Maturidi.
Right. David has made a comment. Ash'ari say God is not composed of parts. They assert attributes to God, but don't see this as composition from parts. Attributes are not God, nor are they God, but meanings relevant to God. Yeah,
and
without
the formulation, the Ash'arites give about the link between God and the attributes. By the way, let me emphasize the point. If you show the question back, here the attributes are not God and not other than God. Neither identical with God nor distinct from God. It is not identical with God. This is the rejection of divine simplicity. Mm-hmm. It is not distinct from God because if you say something...
Notice what he said. He's explaining it the exact same way that I did. That if you understand the first part of the phrase, it's a rejection of divine simplicity. Here's the second part of the phrase.
Is distinct from God. Gairullah. gair, use the term gair. That means it is created in the Asharite tradition.
If it's other than Allah, what the term other means in this context is it's separate and distinct from him, which would then therefore have to be created.
Or the Maturidi tradition. Attributes are not created. It is also rejected. Therefore, they say you can formulate a relationship between divine attributes and God.
Okay, so now he's going to address partially anyway the issue of dependency. So here you go.
By considering these two limits, they are neither identical with God is not identical with attributes, and God is not totally distinct with the attributes. The proper relationship between these two limits is between these limits.
Right. In response to that, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, this is exactly what I said here.
Right. All right. Okay. Yeah. So let's just top it off. Do you want to review this, or you pretty much made your point?
I mean, what we can say positively about God, and the Asherites only say the divine attributes are added to God's essence, and
notice what he said. He said the Asherites say that the attributes are added or super added to the divine essence.
Dependent upon him. Only say the divine attributes are added to God's essence and dependent upon him.
So the attributes are super added to the divine essence, meaning not in time, okay, but they subsist in it, and they are dependent upon him, he says. So he uses the phrase that the attributes are dependent upon God.
Say the divine attributes are added to God's essence and dependent upon him, but they reject that this dependence is a causal dependence. Otherwise,
notice what he said, but they reject that this dependence is a causal dependence.
Otherwise, it would be created. They would be created.
Otherwise, it would be created. So for any Ash'aris or any Maturidis out there who have maybe misunderstood the statement when I used the term dependent, sorry, but I guess you just don't know your own theology. But as we're here as an ethity, I can teach you guys your own theology as well if you need help. We got love for you, but the honest reality is you may think that using the term dependent, which we'll show is not a manner in which we typically speak, but in order to engage the quote-unquote philosophers, this terminology is not only used by the Ash'aris, Maturidis, but I'm going to show Ibn Taymiyyah himself saying the same thing for any Salafis or Ethites or Hanbalis who have a misunderstanding of that as well. But this is the key issue, and this is what is going to go now launch us into a whole understanding of what the word dependent means, how many different definitions the word dependent can have, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what is needed for Khalil's argument to run and actually work, what isn't, and we're going to go through all of that.
They reject that this dependence is a causal dependence, otherwise it would be created. They would be created. But it is a
So he says they reject that it is a causal dependence, otherwise it would be created.
Different kind of dependence, okay?
So he says it is a different kind of dependence. So now, what is that different kind of dependence? So here's where it comes. Here's where it comes when we get into what actually is this type of dependence. What is acceptable to say when God is dependent? What is not? What does this mean? So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read from an English translation of Ibn Taymiyyah's text, which is a commentary on the Asfahaniyya, okay, where he explains this argument that is used, okay, he explains the argument that is used, which is the composition argument, and then he systematically refutes the argument, which is the exact position that I was trying to do in the debate. I said, it depends, and some people thought, well, Jake, were you just dancing around? Were you playing semantics? Were you purposely trying to avoid his question? No. You have to understand when Khalil asks the question is, will God dependent, or is this the word dependent is a negative word in English, especially when you're talking about God. You're going to say, well, God is not dependent, right? So he's trying to use what can be perceived as a negative word, which is ambiguous and can have several meanings, some of which we can accept, some of which meanings we cannot accept, in order for me to answer the question in a bad way that can have a rhetorical appeal to the audience to say, ha, 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 Jake believes God is dependent. This is the idea. Fortunately, I wasn't biting, and I already knew he was going to do this. That's why if you watch closely, in my cross-examination section towards the end, I already set him up to ask him the same question so that I can use it against him when he asked me that question later on. Are you talking about a causal dependency? Are you talking about counterfactual dependency? Are you talking about modal dependency? What are you talking about? There are all these different types of dependencies, but you need to specify some of which we can accept, some which we don't. When it comes to a counterfactual dependency, which I'll explain what that is in just a minute, we can accept that. When it comes to a causal dependency, we cannot accept it. And it's for the reasons that you'll see in just a minute. 1 second here. Okay. All right. So let's do some background. We're an hour in, so let's see if we could get the rest of it done in about an hour, inshallah ta'ala. So take a little break, take a sip of water. Let's take a sip of water. Let's get into the heart of this whole issue. Now, okay, so this is from the text, Ibn Taymiyyah's commentary on Asfahaniyah. You can find this discussion starting out around page 66, and it goes onwards for another 60 or so pages. Now, this is going to be a shocker. Me reading from this text, this is going to be Ibn Taymiyyah speaking. Those who actually think that Ibn Taymiyyah was not engaged in kalam, that he was not engaged with philosophy, that he did not engage in these type of things to refute these deviants, and in this case, these kuffar like Khalil, well, you're going to see very clearly that he did. He went into detail. He talked about all these different types of dependencies and broke them down and explained which one's acceptable, which one's not, what we say to this, what we say to that. Do we see any of these modern day supposed Salafis and Atharis doing this? Are they going to now condemn Ibn Taymiyyah after this video? Likewise, all of those people that saying we're anti-reason, we're anti-philosophy, we're anti-kalam, we're all saying all this stuff, listen to what Ibn Taymiyyah says. Okay, so anyway, he says this, and I'm going to be primarily reading from here and then explaining what the understanding is and how it applies to this issue. So he says, after Al-Asfahani explains the argument for the maker's existence in his creed, he goes on to explain the argument for his oneness. He says, the argument for his oneness, meaning God's oneness, or that there's only one God, is that he is without composition in all respects. Otherwise, if he were composite in some respect, he would not be necessary in and of himself, which is exactly what Khalil is saying, as he would be dependent upon his components by necessity. And this absence of composition entails further that there cannot exist two of his kind. Okay, so there's two things. If God has components or parts or attributes or is composed, then that would mean that he's dependent and he couldn't be the necessary being. So it's an argument for divine simplicity. Then he says also it further entails that there cannot be more than one necessary being. Otherwise, if there were two of his kind, there would exist two particularized beings that are indistinguishable from each other, which is impossible. In other words, if you have two things and they're not composed, you wouldn't be able to have two things. You could only have one thing. Why? Because in order to have one thing, they would have to be composed of a necessary element and a contingent aspect, or an aspect in which they differ. So you have the aspect in which is the same, and you have the aspect in which they're different. If there's an aspect in which there's the same and an aspect in which there's different, then they're each composed of two aspects. If they were each composed of two aspects, then they both would be contingent, because anything that's composed of multiplicity is contingent. That's the argument. That's the argument to show why you cannot have two necessary beings, is because if you had a supposed second necessary being that differed, if you had a supposed secondary being, it would have to have an aspect of difference from the first necessary being. If it has an aspect of difference, then it's made or constituted of multiple aspects. If it's constituted of multiple aspects, it couldn't be necessary. Therefore, you can only have one necessary being. That is utterly simple. This is the argument. How's that? I'm trying to steel man the position, and then we'll take it apart, because I actually care about being honest and trying to refute these positions, unlike some other my critics. So then Ibn Taymiyyah responds and says, Al-Asfahani took his argument from the statements of Abu Abdullah al-Razi, who in turn affirmed it in accordance with the ways of the Aristotelian philosophers such as Avicenna or Ibn Sina and his likes. For this composition argument is the principal argument by which these philosophers established the Tawheed. So notice, and this is why I'm going through this part first rather than just refuting the position. You have to understand that for Khalil and these other mutafalsifa, these kuffar, their entire position of Tawheed, or lack of it, I should say, is based on this false argument which they have asserted. This is what Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah said. He says, it is a false argument, and their intent in this insertion is to negate the attributes of Allah, or the Maker, which I agree. And that's why any Sunni Muslim should not be using this argument. If they are using it, they need to be corrected, and I agree with that. Simple. Is that clear enough for you folks out there, for my critics? See, show me if I've ever used that argument. I don't use that argument. And if I did, and I mistakenly used it, or it was understood incorrectly, then I repent from that, because I don't believe in this false argument. Now, the Muslim scholars have clarified the fallacy of this argument, as has Abu Hamid al-Ghazali clarified this in his book, which was the Refutation of the Philosophers. Okay, so he's saying, Ibn Taymiyyah now is referencing Ghazali, saying that he refuted this false argument, right? And then he goes on to say, and also Ar-Razi himself faulted this argument in other places. So Ar-Razi also critiqued this argument. And he says, as for Asfahani's statement, further statement, which is a quote now, this absence of composition entails that there cannot exist two of his kind. Otherwise, if there existed two of his kind, there would exist two particularized beings that are indistinguishable from each other, which is impossible. Then Ibn Taymiyyah says, they famously explain this in the following way, quote, if there existed two necessary beings, then the two beings would have in common the property of necessity. If then each of the two beings is said to be distinguished from the other one by itself, then each one of the two beings would be composed of one, that which is shared by the two beings, for example, necessity, and two, that which is distinguishing the two beings, their existence or any other property that you want to think of. As such, each one of the two beings would be a composite being. But it has already been stated that that composition cannot possibly exist in a necessary being. This is their claim anyway. On the other hand, if each being is said to be indistinguishable from the other being, then this would entail that the two beings exist without any measure of distinction between them in any respect, and that therefore they are identical, such that they are in fact a single being. So he's explaining the point of the argument, which is what I've already explained myself. And by this argument from composition, they affirm that all of the bodies are contingent and are thus in need of an incorporeal maker. And he goes on and on to explain this. And then he talks about this. Okay, and by this very argument from composition, they neglected all of God's attributes and thereby became among the staunchest of people who conform to the ways of the Jahmiyyah, for they claim that the affirmation of God's attributes contradict this Tawheed, or, this position. So you have to understand that this is the crux. This is the crux of the argument between divine simplicity and a lack thereof. They need this argument in order to establish their position that God is simple. It's the pinnacle of their position, right? And I'm being hyperbolic, but it's such an extremely important argument for them. Now, here's how Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah responds. Okay, these are the first three responses to the composition argument. Okay, now look. He says, many of the rational minds have realized the fallacy of this argument from composition, such as Abu Hamid al-Ghazali and others. This fallacy is demonstrable from many aspects. The first aspect is to say the statement of one who says that a composite thing is dependent upon its components, which in turn contradicts necessity of existence, is an impermissible statement. Okay? At most, such a composition entails that the component of a composite thing is one part among its parts. But the statement of one who says that a composite thing depends upon its part is not greater than a statement of one who says that it depends on its whole. For dependency on the whole is greater than the dependency on a part of the whole. That which depends on the whole is dependent on each and every part of the whole, whereas that which depends on one part from the whole is not necessarily dependent on every other part. So he's saying, look, even if we granted you for the sake of argument that the whole is dependent on each of its parts, you believe that the whole is dependent upon the whole, which is itself, which is greater than the whole being dependent upon any part. So he's just kind of, look, saying if you want to play games, look, we could play games too. Now he says, now this dependency of the composite thing on the whole is in fact a dependency on its own self. And the statement of one who says a thing depends on itself is equivalent to the meaning intended when one says that it is necessary in and of itself. As such, it becomes known that such a self-existence does not entail any dependency that contradicts necessity, meaning that God depends on himself, so there's no contradiction in this whatsoever. And that's the first refutation. The second refutation, or the second aspect, is to say the meaning of the necessary of existence that is inferred from the contingency argument contradicts the dependency of the necessary existent on something that is external to itself, not something internal to itself. Indeed, all contingent things are in need of an existent that is not contingent and that exists in and of itself. This self-existence of the necessary existent contradicts its dependency on something that is outside of itself. So it doesn't mean that God can't be dependent on himself. He's saying the argument which we use to establish the creator and the necessary being is that everything requires an external cause for itself. Okay, not that something can't be dependent upon itself, although we'll get into what that means later on. We want to refute the notion that we're talking about just circular dependence or some type of problem like that. That's not what we mean. He says, thus, if it is said that it is existing in and of itself, independent of all others, and also that it is dependent upon another that is outside of itself, a contradiction will follow. As for that which included with the meaning of its existence, such as its part or attribute, then it is not something that is outside of itself, such that it may correctly be said its dependence on it contradicts its necessity. So it means, again, God is dependent upon himself, not something outside of himself. There's no problem in the claim that you're making, because we don't establish, your assumption is automatically going to be, well, but what about this? You're assuming the composition argument, which is the very thing we're rejecting. We're not rejecting a composition argument because we believe in the God that we believe in. No, we establish the God that we believe in based on other principles and arguments, and we don't use your false composition argument because it's a bad argument. Even atheists can reject it. You don't need to accept it. Atheists don't need to accept it at all. Now, here's the third aspect. The third aspect is to say that the term other, which is something that Dr. Nazif mentioned, can be used in two ways. The first definition of two others is that they are two things, each of which can be known without knowing of the other thing. The second definition of two others is that they are two things, each of which can be separate, key word, from the other thing, either in existence, location, time, etc., etc. He says the first definition is the one used by the Mu'tazila and the Taymiyyah. The second definition of otherness is the one used by the Kullabiyya, the Ash'a'ira, and those who agreed with them amongst the jurists and the students of the four Imams, meaning Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. As for the leading Imams of Ahl Sunnah, like Ahmad ibn Hanbal and others, the term other is in their view ambiguous and accepts both definitions. For this reason, the Salaf as-Salih, the pious predecessors, did not state absolutely that the attributes of God are other than him, nor did they say absolutely that they are not other than him. For example, they did not say that the speech of God is other than God, nor did they say that it is not other than God. Rather, they would ask the person who claims this to clarify his intention, meaning, what do you mean by other? For he may be intending the first definition, just as he may be intending the second definition. This nuanced approach is the method of the skilled experts among those of reason. This matter has been explained at length in another place, meaning in another work of his, which he's mentioning. Then he goes on to say, hence, if the person is using the second definition of otherness, then it will follow that the concomitant, quote unquote, part or attribute of a thing is not other than it. In this way, the affirmation of such an attribute or part for the thing would not entail the dependency of that thing on another, and therefore necessity would not be contradictory. Meaning, if what you mean by other is completely separate and distinct, we don't affirm that, and therefore there's no problem. There's no breaking of the law of excluded middle. There's no dependency in the way that you understand it or you're trying to argue for. Then he goes on to say, by contrast, if the person is using the first definition, so notice how he's breaking this down, which is exactly what I was doing. You can't just use a word like other. You can't just use a word like dependent. You can't just use these kind of words which are ambiguous, which have many meanings, and expect, oh, I need to just boom, 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 answer it. No. And I'm allowed to, in the cross-examination, ask a clarifying question of, well, what do you mean by this? That is valid in a cross-examination section for clarification on the question itself. Because you cannot answer a question and form an argument based on an ambiguous term that is not clearly defined. Now, then he goes on to say, but if the person is using the first definition, then the affirmation of such a meaning of otherness is inevitable. Indeed, it is possible to know that God exists, that he is necessary, that he is a creator, and to know that he has knowledge and will, which the philosophers refer to intelligence and providence, and so on. These various meanings are others according to this definition of otherness, for each meaning can be known without knowing the other meaning. But they are nonetheless meanings that are necessary to the existence of the necessary being. Now, since the affirmation of such others is necessary to him, it is not permissible to negate them. This is because their absence would entail the absence of the necessary being, which is impossible, meaning in order for the necessary being to exist, he must have attributes. Therefore, it becomes known that such a meaning of otherness does not contradict necessity, even if it is referred to as a composition, which we don't use that term, but even if you use that, still you wouldn't have it. Now, in other words, if it is claimed that the necessary being does not depend on another, okay, it will be asked in response, do you intend to say that he does not depend on an other which may be separate from himself, or that he does not depend on another that is a necessary concomitant or lawazim of his existence or his essence? The first negation is correct. As for the second negation, it is not permitted if the dependency on the other is said to be an entailing of that other. Okay? So, you have to understand that this conversation is very deep. It depends on what you mean by certain words and certain terminology. Now, here's the fourth response to the composition argument. Okay? And are you shocked that this is Ibn Taymiyyah that I'm reading right now? Are you shocked that this is Ibn Taymiyyah? For all of you, super Salafis out there who have been warning against me for using reason and these arguments and the Greeks. Imagine this. Imagine what Ibn Taymiyyah going through all these points anyway, and quoting and referencing Al-Razi and Ghazali. So anybody wants to get me on referencing Dr. Nazif, silly. You don't know anything about the deen. Sorry. Now, the fourth response to the composition argument. Okay, the fourth aspect clarifies this further. And it is to say, using the term dependency in such a context is acceptable neither linguistically nor rationally, meaning you cannot accept the term dependency linguistically or rationally. Rather, this dependence is merely a concomitance, or meaning an entailment of God's existence, which implies statements like the composite thing cannot exist without the existence of its part, or one of the two parts cannot exist without the other part, or 3, the part cannot exist without the existence of the whole, or 4, the attribute cannot exist without the existence of the subject of its attribution, and 5, the subject of attribution, meaning the essence, cannot exist without the attribute. He says, now it is known that each of the two mutually concomitant things that must exist with one another is not required to be dependent on the other thing. Rather, if the two things are said to be contingent, it will be permissible for the two to be effected by a single cause that determines both of them into existence, such that neither one of them would be depending on the other for its existence. For indeed, the dependency of one thing on another is only allowed if that one other thing is said to be influencing its existence, i.e., like an efficient cause. So he's saying, look, this is mere what is called counterfactual dependence. Counterfactual dependence is just that, oh, this thing, it cannot exist without the other, right?
Sorry about that, guys. Give me just 1 second because my Bluetooth here died. Give me 1 second. Okay, can you guys hear me now? Should be good now. Okay, let me go back to reading this here in a second. Okay, so yeah, what I was trying to say is what he's explaining here is when you have a counterfactual dependence, which is saying, oh, God cannot exist without his attributes cannot exist without him. This isn't a causal dependency. That's a counterfactual dependence, okay? And that is not problematic whatsoever, which is what Dr. Nazif was saying as well. And even Khalil himself admits that counterfactual dependence is not problematic. So he needs to make a stronger claim to show that there's an efficient or causal relationship going on or something similar to that, which he failed to be able to do so actually in the debate. And he'll never be able to. Anyway, okay. So he says, as for each of the two mutually concomitant things, okay, where the existence of one merely entails the existence of the other with it, this does not necessitate that each of the two things is dependent on the other in such a way that the other is an efficient cause for it. Even though it can be said, indeed be said, that the existence of each of the two things is a condition for the existence of the other thing. And if one agrees but still claims that each of the 1, 2 mutually concomitant things is dependent on the other thing, in the same way that something is dependent on its necessitating condition, it will be said to him in response, our disagreement will then be purely semantic. This is like the dispute over the term circularity, which is also semantic. For circularity can be used to refer to different meanings. 1, epistemic circularity, which is the type of circularity mentioned in algebra. 2, the self-validation, which is the type of circularity mentioned by jurists. Or 3, the rational sense of circularity, which is mentioned by certain rationalists. And some of these rationalists state, in an absolute sense, that circularity is impossible. Others from them explain the difference between the acceptable and the impossible forms of circularity, mentioning that circularity is of 2 types. The first type of circularity, right, is circular dependency. It is the notion that this thing can only exist after that second thing, while that second thing can only exist after the first thing. This type of circularity is impossible in sound reason. Notice he's using sound reason to say that this is impossible. For it entails that a thing precedes the thing which precedes it and succeeds the thing which succeeds it, which is contradictory. It must be existing before itself by 2 steps, and must likewise be existing only after itself by 2 steps. But it is impossible for a thing to exist before itself or exist only after itself. So how can its existence be possible if this contradiction is repeated? So that first type of circularity or circular dependent, causal dependence, he says is impossible. It's rationally impossible. As for the second type of circularity, which is known as interconditionality, or what we're talking about here, this counterfactual dependence, it is the notion that this first thing can only exist together with that second thing, meaning they must go together, essence and attributes. While that second thing can only exist with the first thing, meaning the attributes can only exist with the essence. So it's an arrow going in both directions. An example of such a circularity is fatherhood and sonship. And then he goes on to give this example, which we don't really need to get into too much in depth. Now, okay. Here he goes on to say, in much the same way, the disagreement over the term dependency would be purely semantic if the philosophers were to accept this critique of the composition argument, but still refer to entailment as a dependency. Indeed, the intention of the philosophers in claiming that a composite thing depends on its parts is not to affirm that it depends on it as a creation depends on its maker, or as an effect depends on its efficient cause. Instead, with the term dependency, they intend to say that there is a concomitance between the part and whole, such that the existence of the whole entails the existence of the part. Now, the mutually concomitant things, such as, and it's going on here about fatherhood and sonship, are not required to depend on each other in any sense that contradicts necessity. This is especially true given the theological principle of those philosophers who claim that God necessitates his effects. So here's the point, and this is why I didn't just pull this out of my hat. It wasn't fed to me in my ear by my paid debate team. Okay, this is the same example that I gave in the debate to show that Khalil's position would result in his God being dependent, is the same exact example that Ibn Taymiyyah gives. I asked Khalil, does God depend on creation to exist? And he actually did wind up saying yes, but then denied that he said. But if you go actually back and watch it, which I may make a short little clip of that to show that he did affirm that. Why? Because he affirms that his God cannot exist without creation, Well, if God cannot exist without creation and creation cannot exist without God, then that's a counterfactual dependence. And that's the same counterfactual dependence that we allow between the essence, that God's essence cannot exist without his attributes, and God's attributes cannot exist without his essence. So if that's problematic, then yours is even more problematic, because your God is counterfactually dependent on something separate and distinct from him, which is creation rather than himself, which is the position that Ibn Taymiyyah goes on to explain here. So now he says, this is especially true given the theological principle of those philosophers who claim that God necessitates his effects, which Khalil does affirm in modal collapse, and that creation is necessary. For indeed, the necessity of God is not contradicted by his necessitating of contingent effects in eternity. If it's not, then how then can his necessity be contradicted by his entailment of his eternal attributes that always accompany and subsist in his essence? And this partly demonstrates the incoherence of those philosophers who negate the attributes of God, showing that their statements are among the most inconsistent in reason. For they claim that the necessary being necessitates this world in eternity, such that he cannot exist without that world, while also claiming that the world is changing. And then watch this. He actually goes further than I did and got a chance to do in the debate. And this requiring and necessitating of an eternal world that does not contradict the necessity of his existence, in their view, then they contradict themselves by claiming that the necessity of God's existence would be contradicted by his entailment of his attributes. They refer to such a necessitating requiring of the divine attributes as a dependency. And they claim that the maker will be composed of the two things, his essence and his attributes, if he is described with these attributes. Then they argue that a composite thing is dependent upon its part. The part of a composite thing is other than it, and the necessary being cannot depend on another, thereby concluding that the necessary being cannot be described with attributes. He's laying out their argument again, which we've already gone through, but anyway, repetition is good. With this dependency, they intend to say that God would be entailing his attributes if he were described with them, such that he cannot be existing without the existence of the attribute. Indeed, by saying that he would be depending on the part, they do not intend to say that the part would be an efficient cause for himself. Now, if Khalil believes that whole part or part-whole relationship results in efficient causation and an external efficient cause, then he needs to provide a dalil or proof for this. But he didn't do that in a debate. Then Ibn Taymiyyah says that that's not what you're even trying to do. Whether or not they are, that's another question. He says, for no sane person will say such a thing. There is no sane person who will say that the part of the whole is an efficient cause for the whole. We reject that. So you need to show from first principles and reduce that it is. You can't. It's an assumption on your part, and your whole argument falls apart. Rather, it is known by the consensus of rational minds that it is impossible for the part of a thing to be its maker or efficient cause. However, it is indeed possible for a thing to be both entailed by it and entailing it, such that the thing and its part are mutually concomitant, meaning this counterfactual dependence. Thus, if it is said that, quote, a thing depends on its part, in the sense that the entirety of that thing cannot exist without the existence of some of that entirety, it will be permissible. So if that's what is meant, then it is permissible to say that the whole can depend on a part. Or you can also say, likewise, if it is said that the part cannot exist without the other part, or that it cannot exist without the whole, it is also permissible to say that the part depends on the whole, because it's a counterfactual dependence. Now these philosophers refer to the attributes of God and the to the attributes of God and the attribute of other subject of attribution as parts. That's what they refer to as. We don't necessarily have to accept that, but we can use that language for the sake of discussion. They say, to the people who affirm the divine attributes, if you affirm that God has attributes, then you are in fact affirming that God has parts. Thereafter, they say to them, such an attribution is impossible, for it would entail that God is a composite thing. The composite thing is dependent upon its parts, i.e., it entails its parts. Therefore, such a God would be contingent. Alternatively, the philosophers may say to them, if the attributes which you ascribe to God are essential attributes, that are included in the quiddity, meaning included in the essence, then these attributes will be parts that are constitutive of himself, which is impossible. But if these divine attributes are accidental, then God would be dependent upon another for their attribution. So we say to these philosophers who claim such false arguments, quote, God entails the existence of his notable creations in your view, such that he cannot exist without their creation in eternity. Yet this does not negate that he exists necessarily in and of himself in your view. Rather, the impossibility of existence without these notable concomitants, which are separate from himself, is not false in your view. So, how can you then say his entailment of his concomitant attributes that subsist in his essence is impossible? If this second entailment is said to be a dependency of on his attributes, which you have incorrectly labeled as parts, then this first entailment is also a dependency on his created effects. And it is known that the dependency of a self-existence necessary being on his effect is more impossible in reason than his dependency on his parts or attributes. So very clearly is what he was saying, and what he's saying the exact same thing that I was saying in the debate. If this is what you mean by dependency, then your God is in an even worse situation, because he is counterfactually and dependent upon created effects rather than on himself or his quote unquote parts or attributes. So if you do not refer to this requiring and necessitating of his effects as a dependency, then this requiring and necessitating of his divine attributes, which you have incorrectly described as parts, must not be referred to as a dependency with greater reason. Very clear. I hope people are getting this. A lot of people who are not familiar with this discussion understand this is very in-depth, but this is Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, so don't start whining and crying about it, okay? That this is the reality. This is how we respond, and this is not utilized to construct our theology or to go against Quran and Sunnah. Is to respond and refute these false groups of bid'ah and kufr, these kuffar. Now, okay. And if you chose to refer to the necessitating of his effects as a dependency, but nevertheless say this is not an impossible dependency that contradicts his necessity, for it is his own self that necessitates his effects, then God in reality would not be depending on anything other than himself if it is said that he depends on his effect, which in turn depends on himself. Then it will be said to you in response, quote, his dependency on his attributes that are required and necessitated by his essence is with greater reason not impossible, for God in reality would not be depending on anything other than himself if it is said that God depends on his attributes. Now notice what Shaykh al-Islam says here. And at the root of all of this error is that these people, meaning the philosophers, wish to affirm that God is a universal absolute existence, right? Or wujud mutlaq, that does not have any reality that is specific to himself and by which he distinguished from other things. So notice it goes back to this whole thing of how he used the argument from arbitrary limits. There's nothing specific about their God. It's only general. And so he cannot be distinguished from other things. But if he cannot be distinguished from other things, then he's identical to his creation. You have wahdat al-wujud and all this other nonsense. Or you just admit that your own argument doesn't work because you've refuted yourself. So then he says, rather they claim that God is distinguished from other things by negative attributes only. But in fact, such a necessary being can only be estimated in the mind. The existence of such a being in the external reality is in itself impossible, as this has been explained in other relevant places. The necessary existent that is evidenced by the existence of the contingent things, meaning the way in which we Muslims argue for it, not kuffar, is only that thing which exists in and of itself, does not accept non-existence, and does not depend on anything that is independent of it, meaning that it's caused or has an external cause. This is how we use the argument. This extent of the definition implies through numerous methods of demonstration that the necessary existent must be described with various attributes, as it has been explained in detail elsewhere. Meaning, not only does our argument, our contingency argument, not and notice he's referring to him allowing and using the contingency argument for all of those, Mr. Sajid Lippim and friends, who said that Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't allow for the contingency argument or claim that it's haram or bid'ah or from the from the asal or from the root, and all of this stems from the kuffar or the Greek pagan philosophers. He's referring to it right there, the necessary existent that is evidenced, wajib al-wujud, that is evidenced by the existence of contingent things. Contingency argument, my friend. He says that the way we demonstrate it, we don't do it by their ridiculous method, even though we do it by a rational means, or we can at least anyway. The extent of the definition implies through numerous methods of demonstration, right? That the necessary existent must be described with various attributes. So we can prove that the necessary being has certain various attributes, and we can prove that the necessary being through reason. So what Sheikh al-Islam is saying, and it doesn't contradict anything because we don't accept this silly false art composition argument. We reject it. And we say it's deeply problematic. So any Sunnis should not be using this argument. And I don't have a problem calling certain people out. So it is what it is. I'm just stating the facts. This is Deen here. I'm not playing around. Now, he then goes on to say later, skipping down, okay, the fifth aspect that demonstrates the fallacy of the argument from composition is to say that it is undoubtedly true that it is impossible for each of two things to be an efficient cause for the other. This is a necessary proposition on which all rational minds agree. So two efficient causes cannot be the cause of each other. It is a self-evident proposition that is known immediately once its two ends, meaning the subject and the predicate, are conceived, even though some of the people may infer it from the further evidence, such as when they say, it is not permissible for each of the two things to be an efficient cause for the other, for an efficient cause precedes its effect. As such, if it were an efficient cause of its efficient cause, it would follow that it precedes its own self due to its being a cause for its cause. Also, it would follow that it succeeds itself due to its being an effect of its cause. This is a contradiction. For this reason, this type of circular dependency was said to be impossible. We have written at length on this notion of circular dependency and the discussions that surround it when we expounded on the question of the maker's existence as well as other questions. By contrast, it is not impossible for each of two things to be a condition for the other, for that only entails that each of the two things exists together with the other thing, which is not impossible. This is why it is said that the interconditionality or counterfactual dependence is not impossible. As such, if it is said that the composite thing depends on its part, the meaning intended will simply be the composite thing does not exist without its part existing together with it. This does not at all necessitate that its part exists before it. Additionally, that part cannot be an efficient cause for the composite thing. It is not something that is external to its existence either. Okay. And this meaning of conditionality does not necessitate that the composite thing is dependent on a cause or is in need of an efficient cause. Nor does it necessitate that a necessary existent if composite must have an aspect that is conditioned on some external condition that is outside of itself or outside of himself. Nor does it necessitate a circular dependency within himself. As for the interconditionality within himself, that is necessitated by this meaning. It is not impossible, nor does it contradict the necessity of his existence, unless it is proven first that such a plurality of interconditional meanings contradicts the necessity of his existence. However, the philosophies have attempted to demonstrate that such a plurality contradicts his necessity using the composition argument only, meaning this is the very argument you're using to refute that. So it would be circular to just state that again. It has been demonstrated that such composition is not a sound evidence for the alleged absence of plurality within the necessary being. Okay? So this is Ibn Taymiyyah's explanation of it. 1 second. Now, let me show very clearly here. Let's go here. Okay. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah then goes on to quote who? Guess what? Ar-Razi, one of the heads of the later Ash'ari creed. So let's listen to what Ar-Razi said, because some clown Ash'aris and Maturidis, let's just be frank, didn't understand what I meant when I say that there's a counterfactual dependence. Now, here, Ar-Razi admits the same thing and has no problem with it, and then actually turns the tables, as Ibn Taymiyyah did the same thing, on these philosophers. So this is Ibn Taymiyyah quoting Ar-Razi. He says, now the previous statement by Ar-Razi, here he goes on. Here. Let me skip down further. Okay, so he says, he mentions on the question of divine attributes, okay, after stating the doubts of these groups who negate the divine attributes, this is what he says. And then here's a quote from Ar-Razi. The second argument of the negators is that they say, if the essence of God were described with attributes that subsist in it, then the divine reality would be composed from the essence and those attributes. And if it were composed as such, then it would be contingent. For one, every composite reality is dependent upon its parts. And two, each and every one of its parts is other than it. Therefore, every composite reality is dependent upon another. But such a dependency is impossible for the exalted God, because three, he is necessary in and of himself and does not depend on another. Therefore, the essence of God cannot possibly be described with attributes. So this is Ar-Razi's explanation of the argument, which is pretty much the exact same way that Ibn Taymiyyah explained their argument. And then he says, Ar-Razi then responded to this composition argument by saying, quote, regarding their claim that the affirmation of the divine attributes necessitates the presence of multiplicity within a divine reality, which in turn implies that this divine reality is contingent and dependent on another, which is impossible, we say to them the following, meaning Ar-Razi says to them the following. If you intend by this dependency that one, the divine reality will be in need of an external cause, then this does not follow. This is the key point, that their whole argument assumes that a mere multiplicity necessitates an external cause. We reject that. What is your proof for that? You have no proof for it from first principles. You have none. It's an assumption. It's an axiom which you use to create the entire rest of your false argument. in order for you to reject the Quran, in order for you to reject the Quran, in order for you to reject the Sunnah, in order for you to reject the God of the Quran and Sunnah, this is what you've done. And this is deeply problematic. And that's why we're warning against it and we're refuting it systematically and academically. Simple. You don't like it? Too bad. Then he goes on to say, it does not follow. This is because the divine attributes may very well be established in the very divine essence that is in itself necessary. But if you intend by this dependency that the divine attributes will be conditioned in their existence on that specific essence, then we indeed hold this view. So where is the contradiction? So he says, if that's what you mean by dependency, then we hold this. What's your problem? There is no problem with it. Then he says, also, relations are ontological attributes that exist in external reality according to your view. Thus, you are obligated to accept this contradiction which you have accused us of. And then he goes on to point this out in detail. Arazi also said afterwards, what establishes the falseness of the statements of the philosophers who say that the thing which is one, meaning God, cannot be an efficient cause and a receptive cause, or composed from causation and receptivity, is that they have unanimously agreed on the fact that God knows universals. Now, they had those kufri statements where they said God does not know, where God doesn't know specifics. He only knows the universals, right? He doesn't know particulars or specifics. But he says they unanimously agree that God does know universals, even though Khalil doesn't believe that God knows universals. And that's actually another main difference between the God of Ibn Sina and the philosophers, the fake philosophers, and the non-existent God of Khalil Andani. He doesn't believe that the God knows universals, but Ibn Sina and the fake philosophers do. So, and he goes on to say that they unanimously agree on the fact that God knows universals. And knowing of a thing is but the occurrence of a formed concept, that the concept to that corresponds to the known thing in the one who is knowing it. And 3, the formed concepts of the known things exist ontologically in the essence of the exalted maker, meaning these concepts and what is known exists in the essence of the maker. And Khalil himself used to admit this, that this is a problem with Ibn Sina's view. And that's why he rejected it. This is even to point, and then here's Arazi. This is even to the point that Avicenna has stated that no contradiction will follow if these mere concepts are not included within the divine essence, but are mere concomitants of it, meaning are mere entailments of the divine essence. If that is the case, the essence of God will be both an efficient cause for these concepts and receptive of them. So how can one who adopts such a position go on to negate the divine attributes of the maker? So he's given a refutation saying your position would refute itself. You're inconsistent, this is all the philosophers are, is just one big ball of contradiction, obfuscation, big terminology, confusing the audience, trying to make it seem like they're smart, but all their positions go back against themselves. So the reason why he's saying, look, if you believe that God knows universals, then he explains what is meant by knowledge. Then even if Ibn Sina says that it's a entailment of the divine essence, it's still in the divine essence, and therefore you have a receptive cause and an efficient cause, or in the way that they're talking about. God is now composed from causing himself in the way that they think that we believe about the attributes and the essence, right? Then Arazi then said, generally, quote, the only difference between the claim of the Sifatiyya, or those who affirm the attributes of God, and the claims of the philosophers concerning the attribution of knowledge to God is that the former says that the attributes subsist in the essence of God, whereas the philosophers say that the intelligible concepts are accidents constituted by the essence. That which is referred to as an attribute by those who affirm attributes is referred to as an accident by the philosopher. And that which is referred to as a substance by those who affirm the attributes is referred to as constitution by the philosopher. The difference is only semantic. There is no dispute over the intended meaning. Meaning they call it what we call an attribute, they call an accident. They affirm accidents for God. We affirm attributes for God. That's what he's trying to say. So they're inconsistent in using this argument. Then Ibn Taymiyyah says, this statement above by Arazi shows that the presence of multiplicity within the divine reality is inevitable. So that also goes for Bob the Builder, this clown who didn't know that we believe in real multiplicity within God in terms of his attributes. I mean, this is just obvious. Every actual Muslim, okay, believes this, not these kuffar and deviants who don't believe or affirm the sifat. That the impossibility with regard to the necessary being is only his dependency on something that is outside of himself. As for his dependency on the interconditional things that are included within the meaning of the necessary existent, it does not contradict his necessary existence. Close quote. Okay? So that is very clear what is being said here. Now, what you guys need to understand is this is a systematic refutation of this waffler, okay, this blagger. Systematic refutation. Why? Why are we doing this? Because this guy is spreading around shubuhat, lying to people, misrepresenting what we believe, even misrepresenting himself at the expense of honesty, okay? And the reality is this. His entire argument, which the entire position of divine simplicity is based on a fundamental assumption that anything with multiplicity must be caused. Prove it. Prove it from first principles. Prove that a rejection of that principle entails a contradiction, which is your standard for proof. You cannot, which is also shows your inconsistency. So, and here's something else I want to say. Since you like to bring in the kuffar, why don't I bring in some kuffar? We have even reputable, top-notch, today considered atheist metaphysicians in the field, such as Jonathan Schaeffer, who reject your argument and your principles and say that we can even go so far to say that the part depends on the whole in even more than a counterfactual sense, and there's still no problem. That would prove that the thing itself is not necessary. You need to show that. You need to show that there's either an efficient causal relationship or something akin to that, which would be problematic. You have not shown that, because all you are showing is that God depends on himself. And we're showing that your own position would be refuted by your own principles. Very simple. Very simple. Okay, now, this was a very long video. I had to read through a lot of material. Ibn Taymiyyah goes on, and for people who want the reference, I already gave it. It's in his commentary on Asfahaniyah, starting out at page 62. It goes all the way until like page 100 something. So 50, 60 pages, he's going on and on with this speech. He's going on and on with this kalam. Okay? Now, you want to claim that Ibn Taymiyyah is not engaging in this type of stuff. He clearly is. So if you have a problem with it, now if you want to say, Jake, you're not equipped for it, fine. Criticize me as I shouldn't be able to do it. That's fine. But don't try to make an argument that in principle this type of speech is problematic. That goes for Sajid and the rest of his little crew making these points. Because unlike you, and that's fine, you can have your position, but stay in your lane. None of you would ever be able to actually hear your opponent's argument, understand it, break it down, then read a text from Ibn Taymiyyah, break it down, explain it to the audience, and explain how it refutes Khalil's position, and explain, you wouldn't be able to do that. Be honest with yourself, because you're not really into that, which is fine. But then just leave me out of it, bro. Leave me out of your situation. Now, again, here's what they want to do. They want to say that every composite or anything that has multiplicity within it would have a whole and a part. Okay? And then they want to say that every part, or in this case, at least in the case of God, the whole of God would be dependent upon his parts. This is their claim. And they want to say that that's more than a counterfactual dependency. They may want to say it's a causal dependency, but we reject outright that it's a causal dependency. However, they want to maybe take something less. They might want to say that it's not a causal dependency. It's something like a grounding relation, that the parts of God, the quote unquote parts of God ground the whole. Well, simply, we can reject that. First of all, we could say, well, it could be, but even if it were true that the parts ground the whole, this type of grounding relationship doesn't prove that a being or this being in question is contingent. We do not believe that any being that has quote unquote parts in which ground the whole is contingent. We never made that claim. I never make this argument from contingency in this manner. So that's the first thing. Second thing, we can easily take the position that the parts depend on the whole, which is when you actually think about what Al-Razi is saying and what Ibn Taymiyyah's position is more likely the case. Because when you talk about the essence, right? What is the essence? The essence is a subjective attribution. So the essence is a subjective attribution. The attributes subsist in the essence. So in some sense, the essence, quote unquote, is more fundamental or grounding the attributes, if we can use that language, right? Okay, so we have no problem. In that case, actually, the attributes are being grounded by the essence. Now, if we go back to Khalil's, and anyway, this is for the sake of argument, but we have to fill certain holes in Khalil's argument because he's not even really clear on his position, right? Let's go back to his initial thing here. Let me share my screen now. Okay. And show you his argument and options he gave in the beginning. Okay, so he made that argument. We completely refuted this idea of law of excluded middle being violated. Okay, then we went on to God's essence. Here's the options. God's essence depends upon his independent attributes. We wouldn't say that God's essence depends upon his attributes. If you mean in the counterfactual sense, mind you, if you mean in the counterfactual sense, then we don't have a problem with this really at all. That God's essence depends on his attributes and his attributes depend on his essence. We don't have a problem with that. Okay. However, likewise, if you are interpreting this dependence, any one of these, so okay, let me rephrase this. If you're interpreting dependence in this case to be counterfactual dependence, we don't have a problem with this, and Khalil's whole argument is gone anyway because it refutes his own position, which we've already shown. If you are interpreting dependence in this case to be a causal dependence, either his essence or his attributes, we reject it, and you need to show the burden of proof is on you to show that we must affirm that God's essence causes his attributes or his attributes cause his essence. You need to show that. We reject that. Now, if you mean in terms of something in between these, which is a type of quote unquote grounding relation, or what is more fundamental than the other, then we would not say that God's essence depends on his attributes. We would say that his attributes depend on his essence in the sense that God's attributes subsist in his essence, but are not separable from them and could never be apart from them in that sense. Okay, so if I'm trying to be fair and saying, well, what he means by dependent here is a grounding relation, then we would X this one out. Okay, if he means by grounding relation that God's essence and attributes are all contingent and are interdependent, then we would reject that. Okay, because we wouldn't say that there's a grounding relation going in both ways. That's contradictory, because grounding relation is only one way. Okay, so 4 would be rejected, number 1 would be rejected. Now, God's attributes are and God's essence are necessary in and of themselves. Again, it depends what you mean by necessary. If you mean by modally necessary, we affirm that. If you mean by that one doesn't ground the other, then okay, we can reject this as well, no problem. Now, this goes to option number 2, which he says God's attributes depend on his essence. Now, on his necessary essence, which Al-Razi just stated, which Ibn Taymiyyah stated. If you mean in terms of this grounding relation sense, or which is more fundamental, then of course, God's essence entails his attributes, and his attributes subsist in his essence, but it's not a causal dependence. He assumes that if you choose option 2, that this necessitates divine simplicity. He says God's essence alone is independent and necessary. Where did you get that? Where did you get that? That alone his essence is independent and necessary. Again, if you mean the sense that it is not, that the attributes don't ground the essence, fine. Now, if you say the attributes are eternal, he thinks that immediately follows from that the attributes are eternal creations that depend upon God. Show me why, if God's attributes depend upon his essence, that would mean that they are creations and caused by God. You need to show that. You have no evidence for it. You are assuming your own position by simply us selecting the second option. And you think, oh, that this necessitates divine simplicity. Now, if you mean by divine simplicity that you have an essence which is simple, fine. But that's not only the claim of divine simplicity. The claim of divine simplicity is that all God is a divinely simple essence, and he has no subjective attribution. He's not a subject, that the essence is not a subjective attribution. So here's the point, because you're again saying that you're thinking that, well, if you select option number 2, this means you accept divine simplicity. No, we're not accepting divine simplicity, because we're still affirming the counterfactual dependence and modal dependence, in which God's essence cannot exist without the attributes. So it does not affirm divine simplicity. It affirms it in the sense that you can have an essence, which is a subjective attribution, which the attributes subsist in, but it does not affirm it in the sense that that therefore entails that the attributes are internal creations of God whatsoever. Nor does it affirm the claim that God exists and God is identical to a divinely simple essence without any attributes. No, we reject that, because we already prove, based on rational arguments and arguments from the Quran, and also arguments from the Quran and Sunnah, that both of these necessitate God having real attributes that are not identical to his essence. And Khalil himself doesn't even affirm the Mu'tazila doctrine of God having any attributes that are identical to his essence. He doesn't believe he have any attributes whatsoever, even relations or negative attributes, which Ibn Sina and the other philosophers accepted. So again, very clearly, if you mean by counterfactual or modal dependence, we accept it. There's no problem. The Ash'aris, the Maturidis, the Ethites, we all accept it. And even we showed, and Al-Razi showed, that Khalil doesn't accept God as knowledge, but Ibn Sina and the philosophers accept it. And that if he's consistent, he would accept it as well. So he's refuting himself. Secondly, if you mean by causal dependency, the burden of proof is on you to establish that there is a causal dependence relation between the attributes and the essence, and that it would result in the attributes being a creation of the essence. You have not shown that whatsoever. So the burden of proof is on you. Now, if you mean by a grounding relation, you need to show that a grounding relation necessitates the contingency of a being in question. And without other than simply asserting it, you need to show that from first principles, which you cannot do. It's a metaphysical principle, which fine, you want to utilize, but we reject that metaphysical principle because it goes against reason and revelation very clearly. And we have other arguments to establish the existence of the creator, which are not dependent upon this false metaphysical principle, which results in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's names and attributes being negated from him. So lastly, you need to show that a grounding relationship of whole part or part whole results in him not being a necessary being, which you haven't shown. You haven't shown it whatsoever. You haven't shown this whatsoever. Okay? Now, if you think that this means, and here's what some of the Christian jokers want to claim, well, Jake, you're contradicting yourself, because that means that something can be necessary and not ase. And this is the same thing Bo Branson tried to pull over. Oh, well, this would then mean, for example, that the son can be dependent on can be dependent upon the father and yet still be a necessary being. However, that's not the case, because they actually use the word cause. They believe it's a causal dependency. They believe it's a causal dependency. Not only that, the person of the son is not merely an attribute. So it's not analogous. It's not analogous to an attribute. The son is a person who is a being with attributes. So you have God the Father, which is a being with attributes. Then you have God the Son, which is a being with attributes. And you have God the Father, a being with attributes, causing the Son a second being with attributes. Simple. It's not the same thing. Number one, we don't believe that the attributes are caused. Number two, if you want to say, oh, you want to switch the language like Joshua Jawade did, and I'm not mocking him, but he switched the language, that he wants to change it to grounding relation. If you want to believe that the Son is eternally grounded by the Father, it's still not analogous, because in that instance, you have a divine being which is being grounded by another divine being. Okay? And that second divine being, the Son, is not an attribute. He is a being with attributes. In fact, Bo Branson himself said he's made up of or composed of two essences. A general essence, or what's called an Aristotelian essence, and a Leibnizian essence. So he's actually composed of two essences. And something which is composed of two essences is not an attribute. So it's not analogous. Now, going back to this issue, one second. Going back to this issue, even Dr. Bradshaw, who I had a discussion with, which I put a video of it on my Twitter channel, my Twitter page, he even says it's not analogous to a divine person is not analogous to a divine attribute. Here's a third thing, which you guys don't understand, and which it seems like this just boom exploded right out of your brain and you totally missed it. Do Muslims say that the attribute of omniscience is God or is divine? No, we don't say that. Therefore, we do not say that each attribute is a God. And therefore, each attribute is not divine. And so each attribute in that sense doesn't have to have no grounding relation whatsoever. However, what you are saying is that the being of the Son himself, which is not merely an attribute, it is two essences together with attributes, that whole being itself is actually causally dependent upon another being, which is distinct from him. So it's, again, not analogous. Now, what they want to try to do here is they want to throw, guess what? We'll throw another Christian doctrine into the mix called perichoresis, which is the inseparability of the persons. The Father, Son, and Spirit are all inseparable from one another. Well, how does this make sense? We can make sense of how an attribute is inseparable from an essence. But how do you make sense of how a being which possesses two essences, one essence which is unique to him, can be inseparable from another being which has his own unique essence? Again, not analogous. So you cannot use this argument, even if you thought it was successful, to refute me and say that Jay can no longer refute the Christian doctrine on the Nicene Creed and that God the Father causes the Son and the Spirit. Why? Again, because we don't make the statement that the attributes themselves are God. We don't make that statement that the attributes themselves are God or are fully God. But however, you say that the Son and the Spirit are fully God. Therefore, you are claiming that the persons themselves, which the persons are caused, are God himself. However, we do not claim that each individual attribute is God himself. We don't say that. Unless you believe in divine simplicity, which we don't. So this is very clear, the disanalogy. Anyway, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this thorough refutation of Mr. Andani. I recommend that he, as well as any of the other disbelievers that may watch this video, who are harboring ill thoughts of me, or even those of bid'ah, or even some of my brothers and sisters, I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide you and me and forgive me for my sins or anything else that I've done that has hurt you. And we invite you to Islam. We're not doing these videos just for refutations. We invite you to Islam and to clear up the shubuhat that some of the kuffar and those who are promoting bid'ah have put forward. So we invite you to the deen, and we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, guide us all, inshallah. Now, this ongoing saga with Khalil Andani and these arguments and back and forth, and he's still continuing. This is the last video refuting these final two arguments. I don't know if I'll be making another video on this subject, because I think pretty much everything has been said. The only final thing that I may do potentially is do a debate review, that just one long video that's basically encompassing everything I've said thus far, and that will just be in one long video, just one long debate review video. That's the only possible, really, I think, video left that I will do on the subject. The haters can keep hating. They can keep talking whatever they want. I may respond in the form of text and putting little things here and there on Twitter or whatever else. But I'm not going to keep going on with too many more of these videos. A lot of people are tired of it. I myself don't really want to deal with most of these people anymore, because frankly, I think they're insincere and dishonest. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide them. But anyway, that's the story, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. I know it's a long video, especially the second argument and the second half of this video. You may have to watch it twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, but it is what it is. Sometimes you need to use this kalam or speech in order to refute. And when I say kalam, I mean speech, in order to refute these kuffar or those guilty of bid'ah. And I asked some of those super Salafi types to look into this. Go and read Ibn Taymiyyah's text. Go and read it in Arabic if you can, or get somebody to take a look at it for you and confirm everything that I said is directly from the text. This is his speech refuting it. Al-Razi is refuting it. Okay? But anyway, guys, I think that's going to be it for now. As I said, might possibly do one more just big debate review video, but I'm not sure, inshallah. And I don't know what videos I'm going to do after this, but maybe we'll start a new series and look into something else, inshallah ta'ala. But anyway, guys, as always, hit that thumbs up button. Make sure you like this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share it, get it out there, and share it with anybody who had any doubts regarding this manner of divine simplicity and dependency and contingency and all this kind of things. And inshallah, I look forward to seeing you next time, guys. But remember, even though we invite to the deen, we still have to affirm the truth. And so I leave you with this. بل نقذف بالحق على الباطل فيدمغه فإذا هو زاهق ولكم الويل مما تصفون. الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.